Hello and welcome. On behalf of the Association of Professional Chaplains, I thank you for joining us today for our APC webinar, The Value of Existential Pain, an opportunity to focus on what is really important. I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Fred Gruey. Fred Gruey is a board-certified chaplain with a Doctor of Ministry degree from the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. He is also an ordained UCC minister working for Providence Hospice in Medford. Gruey is the author of What the Dying Have Taught Me About Living, several peer-reviewed articles, and has presented workshops on end-of-life distress at numerous national and regional conferences. His latest book, Time to Talk About Dying, was recently published by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. A brief question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may type your question into the Q&A area on the left-hand side of your screen at any time. Thank you for your attention. I would now like to turn the call over to our presenter, Mr. Fred Gruey.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon. For those of you in the East, here in lovely Oregon, it's still morning, so welcome. And I just would like to say to begin with, I'm so honored that you decided to take this time to listen in and join for a topic that is so important to me, and I live and breathe this stuff, and I find it incredibly interesting, and so that you would find it of value makes me feel really wonderful. So thank you, honestly. So our topic, the value of existential pain, and this is an opportunity to focus on what is really important for our patients. In the last 13 years, I've been a hospice chaplain. I've been with over 2,000 folks that have passed away. And so what I'm going to share today is actually the first chapter out of the book that I had that was published this summer, Time to Talk About Dying. But it's not just information that I learned working on my doctorate. It's really a great, I want to give honor to all these folks that have allowed me into their lives, that have taught me themselves. And so what I've learned is certainly as much or more from the actual patients and families that have allowed me into their lives than I have from my own studies. So with that, let's take a look at our objectives for this time together. Hopefully, we'll gain an increased knowledge on what the basis and the symptoms of this terribly off-putting thing, end-of-life existential suffering, sounds like, or what it could mean, and what the basis of that stuff is. We'll learn some specific verbal and nonverbal skills to enhance the end-of-life conversations, as well as some non-pharmaceutical therapies to help ease this end-of-life existential distress. And to begin, let me say, some people use the term spiritual distress. I like the term existential distress. For me, and for the purpose of the next hour or so, they're interchangeable. I generally default to existential distress, mostly because I'm imagining that most of you joining us at this time are chaplains. And if I say spiritual, and I get the privilege to talk to a lot of doctors and nurses, and if I use the term spiritual distress, they tune it out like they don't have to worry about that. But if I use existential distress, then they perk up because maybe that's something they should know about. So that's why I generally use the term existential distress. But for me and for this time together, it's the same as spiritual distress. So the great influence on me in approaching this topic is Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M, who is a psychotherapist in the Bay Area. I believe, even at this time, he is in the midst of his own dying process. I haven't gotten any word that he has passed yet, but I know he is in the end of his own life. And if there's any good news in all the stuff he's written about or talked about over the years, I did read an article that he wrote that it said it really worked because he's doing well. So that's at least one anecdotal testimony to the things he's brought forward. But his landmark book in 1980, he wrote a book called Existential Psychotherapy, which sounds a little dense or like a snoozer, but it's a really good book. It's very accessible. It is not filled with a lot of jargon. And in it, he expresses the idea that existential distress is really comprised of these four things on the slide in front of you. So they have to do with what is our sense of meaning? Why am I here in this life? Isolation, the feeling of being all alone in the universe, certainly the issue of death, and then what he calls freedom. And so let me unpack these. So he's saying these four things sort of combine to what we call existential distress. And it's his belief that everybody, all human beings, wrestle with these four things. Most of us from time to time can deal with it pretty well, and we keep it in balance. But there are times where it's just harder to deal with, and so that's when we seek out help. One of the things that I've learned is as people get into the hospice process, the filter for keeping balance on these things wears a little thin, and so they become much more prominent. And that's what interested me in this topic. So, and Yalom believes everybody that goes to see a psychotherapist is really dealing with these four things, but oftentimes, because there's no answer to these four, and if you're hoping that by the end of this webinar you will now know the answers to all these things, I don't want to disappoint you, but we're not going to get anywhere near an answer for this stuff because they're unanswerable. But the good news is by talking about them, it does diminish their intensity and pain. But Yalom believes that everybody that goes to see a psychotherapist is really dealing with these issues, but oftentimes will make up other problems that are more manageable, like alcoholism or sex addiction or whatever other issues to talk about that seem much more manageable to avoid talking about these things. But these things are at the very core of what it is to be a human being. And at the end of life, when people come onto hospice, these are really important things. So our sense of meaning, why am I here? Why am I still alive? What is going on? That is a huge issue that actually got me started into this. I remember early in my days after getting board certified, which I'm sure many of you are aware is so difficult, I was hired at a small hospital here in Ashland, Oregon, little community hospital with a little community hospice. So I was doing hospice and hospital, but it's a 25-bed hospital, so it was a real small thing. I was the only one on staff. And I started to visit all these hospice patients that were struggling with a sense of meaning. Why am I still here? Why won't God take me? I'm ready to go. These kinds of issues. And I didn't know what to say. And so I remember I was on this chat site for chaplains. And it was a very active site at that time. There were chaplains from all over the world on this chat site, and anybody would throw out a question, and there'd be 20 or 30 responses within a day. I mean, it was an incredibly active site. And I remember sitting in my little office at Ashland Hospital typing in, how do you help people reframe a sense of meaning at the end of life? And I sent it off in the hopes that somebody would tell me what to do, and not one response, nothing. And then I really felt alone. I was having my own existential crisis of aloneness, and that's when I started to diligently begin to look at and study these things. So sense of meaning, it's huge, particularly at the end of life. Isolation. Now, by the way, I should tell you I am a Christian chaplain, but I certainly love Buddhism and have been informed a lot from Buddhist teachings, and the Buddhists believe that we're all interconnected, and I certainly buy into that. But this sense of isolation is this experience of life that we have, and the two big, I guess, touchstones of our sense of feeling of isolation in this life. First is pain. When I have a pain, nobody else can feel it, and pain is an incredible reminder to me that in this great vast universe, I really am all alone. Because when I have a pain, nobody else knows. In fact, I have to use metaphors to try and explain to the doctor what my pain is like. And so I could say it's like an ice pick jamming into my head or like razor blades down my back. I have to use metaphors to try and explain because nobody else can feel what I feel. So pain is a great reminder that I am alone, as is death. Death, when I'm dying, I'm the only one that's really dying. It's my experience. And so death is another of those reminders that in this experience of life, I really am all alone. And that can be incredibly terrifying. And certainly death is one of the existential issues. What happens after death? What is dying like? I've had several patients so profoundly look at me and say, how will I know when I'm dead? Oh, which I think is an incredibly great question. But so this, and there are some, and I'm one of those who believe that most of the, or all of the great religious traditions, in part, have been created to help explain this experience of death. Not just how to die, but how to live as well. But that this is one of the great reasons and topics of the great faith traditions. What happens? What is death all about? And then Yalom uses the word freedom to talk about this other element of existential distress or spiritual distress. And by freedom, the word I use is uncertainty. I think that makes a little bit more sense. Yalom wrote his book almost 40 years ago, 1980. So he used the word freedom. I use uncertainty. And here's what he's talking about. Imagine you go to, if you went to Starbucks earlier today, you go to get a coffee. It can be an existential nightmare. There's, do you want decaf? Do you want regular? Do you want Pike's Peak? Do you want dark roast, medium roast? Then there's at least 4 different kinds of non-calorie sweeteners. Then you've got milk. Do you want whole milk, half and half, almond milk, soy milk, 2%? I mean, the possibilities are almost endless. And this is just on a simple request for a cup of coffee. Now, that is hard enough, but when you multiply all of those decisions that you and I have to make throughout the day, and there's really no way to know for sure. How do I know, for example, the bigger existential questions? How do I know who to partner with? How do I know where to live? What job to take? Where should I go to school? Those are huge. But for the folks that you and I serve in hospice or palliative care, the questions are, should I do the chemo? Should I do the radiation? What about alternative therapies? Should I do the surgery? Those are huge existential questions that there is no definitive answer for. And the freedom or the uncertainty of that creates emotional turmoil and stress and this whole thing that we call existential distress. So these 4 things, what does life mean? I'm all alone in the universe. What's this thing of dying and the uncertainty of it all? These combine to create what I would call existential or spiritual distress. Now, there's another guy that I've run into that I like. He's a younger man. Peter Rollins is his name. He's sort of an Irish philosopher, Christian philosopher. He hangs out with Rob Bell, if you're familiar with that name, and they do conferences together. But Peter Rollins has this thing that he talks about the human condition. And so on the human condition, he breaks it down into three areas of our struggle or distress. We struggle between what we have and what we want. We have a tension between who we are and who we want to be, and then the one I was just talking about, this uncertainty in life. We have to make decisions. There's just some things we have to do, and we really never know for sure what to do. And so these are areas of this existential distress. Now, on the right hand there, you see under God, some folks that you and I visit, or even some of us, there have been times in my life when I've done this, we look to God to give us the answer, the definitive answer. God, who should I be? What is it? What's your desire for me? Or I have to make this, should I marry this person? Should I not? Should I go for this degree at school? Should I not? So we ask God to give us certainty where there is not a lot of certainty. Or some people look for science or data. I gave a talk earlier this year, In God We Trust, Everyone Else Must Have Data. It was for a bunch of doctors and nurses, because what does the literature say has become And so in some circles, the new God. Give us, and it's this quest for certainty where there is not a lot of certainty. And so some people default to science or God. But what Peter Rollins talks about that I love, it's in the middle where those arrows are. That's where the life is. That's where reality is. That's where the possibility for deep relationships is in the not knowing. And we struggle because we want to know. We feel like we have to know. We should know. But a lot of these things we just don't know. But it's in the not knowing where real life and the possibility for deep relationships is. I'm reading again for like the fifth or sixth time Pema Chodron's wonderful book. She's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, C-H-O-D-R-O-N. She has a wonderful book, Comfortable with Uncertainty. And it's 108 short devotional kind of readings. But it's learning to become comfortable in this not knowing, in this uncertainty of life. And I find great value in it for me. All right, so enough about sort of the essence of what I'm calling existential or spiritual distress or pain. What are the symptoms? When you meet some, in my 13 years of being a hospice chaplain, I've never once walked into a room and have someone laying on a bed and saying, "Thank God you're here. I've been struggling with existential distress, and I know that's what you did your doctorate in, and I'm so glad you're here. Now you can help me." And nobody's ever said that to me. So the symptoms or the signs of existential distress are often, why me? Why is this happening to me? Why now? And this can happen to anybody. I remember I met a woman 105 years old, and she was admitted to our hospice care. I come in the room. Hi, I'm the hospice chaplain. She's 105, looks at me from her bed and says, "Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this?" And I remember I looked at her and I said, "You're 105. What did you think was going to happen?" And she laughed, but that can hit anybody at any time. Or what did I do to deserve this? Why won't God just take me? I'm ready to go. This is the one I hear the most, and I imagine you do too, because when you show up in a patient's room and you're an agent of religion, people pull out the God talk because they think that's what you hear. But I remember this one little lady I met, her family called her Pit Bull, was her nickname. She was about 95 years old, maybe 5 foot tall, maybe 80 pounds if she was soaking wet. And she was living in her own home on her hospital bed in the living room, you know, the routine. And she had been a lifelong Presbyterian, had been an elder at a Presbyterian church for like 50 years. 95, she had raised 5 generations of family, huge, loving family. We're all rotating in and out to care for her in her own home. She was not in any physical pain. So I showed up. Hi, I'm the chaplain. And I wasn't in her house 5 minutes. And she's looking at me from her bed. She says, "All right, why won't God take me? I'm ready to go. Let's get this on." And I looked at her and I said, "Look, Pitbull, I've been in this, I've been a minister all my life, over 40 years. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. God is horrible at taking orders." And she laughed. And I said, "I've tried to teach him. I've screamed. I've yelled. He shows no interest, or she shows no interest at all." And so we got on. And she relaxed for, the half hour or so I was with her, and she was doing better when I left. But I'm back a week later, and she's right at it again. "Why won't God take me? I'm ready to go. Let's get this on." And I can remember I looked at her and I said, "Pitbull, here's the deal. You're on hospice care. You're dying. That stinks. But you're in your own home. You're safe. You're warm. You're not in any pain. And that people that love you have flocked together to come and make sure you're okay. Now that's as good as it gets. Quit your bitching." And she looked up in shock at me and said, "Thanks. I needed that." Remember, her name was Pitbull, so I knew who I was talking to. But I don't talk to everybody that way. But this whole thing of why am I still here? Why won't God take me? And I call that the great Christian existential question. Why won't God just take me? Now realize in context, here in Oregon, where I work, nearly everybody I meet is in their 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s. So I'm not on a cancer unit for children. I'm not in a NICU. So most everybody that I meet has at least had a shot at a decent life. Now, whether they had a good life or not, at least they had a shot. And so that's their question. Why won't God just take me? I'm ready to go. But I realize that's not everybody's context of work, but that is mine. Is there hope? What happens after I die? Can I be forgiven? How long is this going to last? Will it be painful? How will I be remembered? These are the symptoms or the signs of existential distress. Now, I believe that there is great value in this sort of pain. And here's what I mean by that. I think pain is a great change agent. If you and I were to sit down at one of our Starbucks coffees that we've existentially figured out how to get a decent cup of coffee, and you and I were having a conversation, and I were to say, if you think back over the most transformative periods in your life, periods you would look back and say, boy, I really grew to become a more compassionate or a wiser human being. And if I were to ask, when did that happen? I would almost bet, paying for the coffee, that you would tell me it was either during a really painful time in your life or just after. But pain is a great change agent. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from the Greek playwright Aeschylus, who created the whole genre of dramatic theater. And in his play Agamemnon, the first dramatic play ever written, Aeschylus writes, "He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and against our will comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God." And what Aeschylus was asking 2,800 years ago, this Greek poet, the only way that anybody becomes wise, and I would add compassionate, is through suffering, through pain. It is the great change agent. It teaches us, reminds us that we're alone. It's also the first step our 12-step sisters and brothers would tell us, and it's the first step in a wake-up call. You have to realize there's a problem. And existential pain and distress tells us there is a problem. It can shatter our false illusions of self-importance, that I am the center of the universe, that all revolves around me. And it is an opportunity to focus on what really is important in living, in life. And that's the relationships with the people that care for us and that we care for. It's also, according to Breitbart at Sloan Kettering, it's very normal at life's end that existential distress is normative. And that's one of the things, I go back and forth with in our own hospice care. I mean, I know a lot of the pharmaceutical therapies, Haldol, Seroquel, Ativan, to try to treat this stuff. And I say, but if it's normal at life end, why are we just doling out a lot of drugs to sedate it? There's a great quote attributed to Carl Jung: you don't want to medicate a pain before you learn what it has to teach you. And so I find that when this existential distress or pain is happening in someone's life, that is a fertile time, an incredibly fertile time for reflection, for exploration, and for spiritual growth, and for healing of relationships. And so I think there can be great value in it. Now look, it can be really painful, and some people just become mean and bitter. So I'm not saying it's guaranteed that it's going to happen, but I'm saying the possibility for growth is right there in the middle of all this stuff. And when I'm going through my own existential crises, which I go through, I try to remind myself, this is an opportunity to grow. This can be a wake-up call. This can be an opportunity for me to become more human, more compassionate, wiser. Now, I tell myself, because it hurts so bad, that to try to get myself through that. But I think that's one of the great gifts that existential distress has to offer us. Now, in dealing with folks that are suffering from existential distress, one of the great things that we can do is help them to reflect on their life. Now, a couple of years ago, I was listening to one of the great courses from the Teaching Company. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I love to learn, and I'm always trying to learn new things. And so I thought I would take this Teaching Company class on existentialism. And so I was driving around in Southern Oregon, visiting dying patients and listening to lectures by Robert Solomon from the University of Texas on existentialism. And I have to be honest, the week I was listening to his lectures on Albert Camus, and Camus' whole question, suicide's really the only question there is because all of life is absurd. That was a hard week visiting dying patients and listening to Camus. But in the lectures, Solomon brings out a great point that the existentialist philosophers offer to us. In English, we have the word reflection. It has two primary meanings. If I look into a mirror and I can see my image, I see my reflection looking into a mirror. And also when I sit and pray or have my quiet time, I'm reflecting on my life. And Solomon says in his lectures that these two meanings of the word reflection are interconnected. I am a father. I am a chaplain. I work for a huge Catholic system here in the Northwest. I visit hospice patients. I am also from West Virginia, so I'm a huge West Virginia Mountaineer fan. And so these are all aspects of my life. And so when I'm talking to Bob, my West Virginia friend during football season, he reflects back to me, Fred, the West Virginia Mountaineer fan. When I'm with my son, he reflects back to me, Father. When I'm with my colleagues here at the office, they reflect back to me, Chaplain or Fred the colleague. And when I'm with my patients, they reflect back to me, Minister. Now, these are just all pieces of who I am. They're not the sum total. But I need these pieces so that when I sit and reflect on my life, I put these pieces together to try to have some idea of who I am, why my life has meaning, how I'm making meaning. And so we put these things together in reflection. And I have found this for patients that I'm visiting that are suffering with existential issues, reflecting back to them who they are can be an incredibly wonderful and rich therapy that has really not negative side effects. And so this is just David Biro from his Language of Pain talks about how we need these two reflections to have some access to our meeting. So that's enough theory on that. Here's a story that putting this theory into some flesh and bones might be helpful for you in your own practice as you care for the folks that you do. I remember I came back to the office here and Nurse Pam was laughing. She says, by the way, Ben wants to see you. And I said, why are you laughing? She said, oh, you'll see. So I went out to see Ben. Ben, in the first hour I was there, smoked about 500 cigarettes. It was one right after the other. Every other word was the F-bomb. He had this gravelly voice. He was in a wheelchair. And when I went out to see him, he's telling me he had spent most of his life in prison. He had, as a career choice, been the collecting agency for mobsters in the Midwest, and that's how he ended up in prison. And so for people that didn't pay their gambling debts, the mobsters would send Ben to get their money. Now, Ben was telling me he had a horrible life growing up. His father had been an alcoholic police officer and had horribly beaten Ben and his mother for the first years of Ben's life. His father would get drunk and then just beat both of them. And when Ben turned around 10, his father finally deserted them and left. And Ben told me that on his 21st birthday, he went out and got drunk, tracked his dad down, and beat the crap out of his father. Said it was the greatest day in his life. Said it was better than any sex he had ever had. He found his father and beat him up. So this was Ben's story. And he's telling me that's why he's smoking the cigarettes and dropping the F-bombs. And I figured he's just trying to blow me off. And so I continued to see him almost every week. And very colorful stories, as you can imagine. He told me, as we got to know each other, that somewhere in his mid-30s, he was out of prison, and he met a woman named Katrina that he absolutely fell in love with. And for the first time in his life, he started to do things for someone else that weren't for him. He just loved this woman, and it really changed him, brought him to life in ways he had never imagined. And then years later, she died of cancer, and he was with another woman now when I met him. And we just got to be dear friends. Now, I would always have to visit him at the end of the day because he was always smoking like a chimney. He lived for months, it seemed, on just coffee and cigarettes. And I was about a week or two before he died. I went to see him, and he couldn't even drink coffee or smoke at that point. He was in his hospital bed. And I remember he looked up at me and he said, why do you come here? What do you get out of this? Why do you come see me? And I looked at him and I said, well, the truth is, Ben, you are an icon of hope for me. He said, what the hell? I said, you're an icon of hope. I said, I look at you, and I know you had a crap life. And you told me how the power of love liberated you and changed you. And I figure if love, the power of love can change you, maybe it could do the same for me. And he started crying, and I started crying. Now look, all I was doing was reflecting back to him what he had revealed to me of who he was, that he had forgotten. And I learned from him the power of reflecting back to these incredible people that we meet, that are so afraid, that are wrestling with so many things. If we can reflect back to them the beauty that we have seen from their story, from their life, it has incredible therapeutic value. Now here's the catch on this. It's got to be real. You just can't make up something that sounds pretty or you wish they would have done, because then it doesn't have a hook to connect to. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be real. But boy, there is so much power in sharing with someone what they've taught you, what you've learned from them, the beauty you've seen from their life that you want to incorporate in your own living. I'm telling you, it is incredibly powerful at helping to alleviate existential distress. Now, it's not going to cure it. It's not going to make it go away, but it does alleviate it, and quite honestly, that's enough. And, I want to give you that disclaimer again. If you're thinking there's going to be a cure for this stuff, that's not the truth. What I've learned about existential distress, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is there's no cure for this stuff. The good news is that just by talking about it in an honest, real, not depressing or maudlin way, but just in a real way, diminishes its pain. And the even better news is that by talking about this stuff in a real way can become the very fertile soil for rich and deep relationship with another human being. And that is incredibly powerful at alleviating existential distress. It's relationships. Meaningful relationships have incredible therapeutic value. And if this is just a hospice patient that you're seeing once or twice a week or once or twice a month, that can be incredibly meaningful, even for a month or two. There is, I'm telling you guys, there is therapeutic value in this stuff, not just for the patient, but for us as well. And so this next slide is some information that I've learned about the difference between healing and cure. I got to write an article a couple of years ago for the Plain Views, I think it was, that online journal, Healing in Hospice. And this is something that I've thought about quite a bit. To be healed is different than cure. World Health Organization, to be healed this is in their preamble to their document. To be healed means to regain wholeness in the physical, emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual aspect of the human experience. So healing and cure are two different things. Healing encompasses the whole of our humanity, where cure is a medical term, a scientific term. Cure is about getting bad cancer tissue out of a body, or a spot off of an x-ray, or bad bacteria out of a bloodstream. That's cure. Healing encompasses the whole of our humanness. Healing is independent of illness, as Dr. Kleinman talks about, Arthur Kleinman, and Pilch, John Pilch, in his book, Healing in the First Century. Well, John Pilch has this wonderful book. I forget the title of it right now, but it's got some nifty little thing like Healing in the Mediterranean Culture of the First Century. But what Pilch landed on, which was really helpful for me as a Christian, he looked at the healing stories of Jesus. And in the Mediterranean culture of that time, there were many diseases, skin diseases, that were lumped under the word leprosy, which is different than the actual leprosy we diagnose today. But almost any contagious skin disease was considered leprosy in the Mediterranean culture of the first century. And so people were quarantined. If you had one of these diseases, you would not be able to live in your own home or go to work or eat with your family. You had to live on the margins of the community and carry a bell and yell, "Unclean, unclean," if anybody were to approach you. And Jesus said, Pilch talks about when Jesus would heal somebody, he would say, "Now go show yourself to the priest." This is so you could be brought back in to the community. The priest was the gatekeeper to allow you back in. So even if you weren't cured, you could be healed. You could be brought back in. And you were no longer considered contagious or a threat to the welfare of the community. And so being reconnected to our roles and our relationships, that's where the healing really occurs, our roles and our relationships. My role in the family as a father, as a breadwinner, as a caretaker, as the nurturer, if I can be reestablished into that and to the relationships with the individual people, that's where healing often occurs. And I'll use that with some of our dying patients. You know, they're now confined to a bed. They can't be the breadwinner anymore. They can't do this. But I'll say, look, your family is terrified. You're dying. You've been their teacher for many years. Teach them now what it means to die. Show them what it's like. Show them not to be afraid. If I can help restore this patient's roles and their relationships, I'm doing them some therapeutic value without the side effects of a lot of the pharmaceuticals. If I can, anything that we can do to strengthen the roles and the relationships of our patients is of therapeutic value. So I'm always looking for ways to do that. So having the end of life conversation, there are, you know, it's a scary thing to have. And oftentimes, if you guys are like me, sometimes they'll say you can't use the hospice word, or mom doesn't know she's dying, and so the family doesn't want to talk about it. You go in, you talk to mom. Mom goes, "What are you?" I'm a chaplain from the healthcare. So am I dying? Am I on hospice? Yeah. You know, they know, but the family doesn't want to talk about it. And so sometimes I've just learned you don't have to do anything. You just sort of sit there and let things unfold. A lot of communication is not the words that we use. My undergraduate degree was the acting and directing, and when I was in acting school, they taught us communication is more than 85% non-verbal. It's not the words. It's tone of voice. It's facial expression. It is body language. It is possible appropriate touch, holding a hand or hand on a shoulder if it's appropriate. That's 85% of communication. So you don't have to have pretty words. You don't have to have wise words. You just need to be fully present. I know you guys know this stuff. I can't imagine much of what I'm saying to you is all that new at this point, but maybe it's bringing it a fresh outlook or to the front burner. If you got to go see some folks later today, these are things that you can put back into your practice. But so I try not to be real active or feel like I've got to come up with brilliant or witty things, just to be with them, but with all of me. And that silence is often therapeutic. You know, sometimes, I'm sure it happens to you, you go visit somebody on hospice and they want you to pray for a miracle. They're not ready to die yet. God still has a plan for them. There's purpose in their life. And would I pray for them for a miracle? And I always do. I pray for them like they were my mother and I want them to live. Because why not? I mean, what's the point of saying, oh, are you crazy? You're on hospice. You're not. There's no sense to that. And I've learned if I can pray with them and they feel that I am on their side, then if and when the realization comes that they're not going to get a miracle this time and it is their time to die, then they know that I'm someone on their side and they'll let me in. And so these are, and I trust, and this may sound weird to you as a minister, but I trust in the disease process, that the disease will do its job, that pain and suffering will do what they do, and that this is an opportunity for all of us to become more awake, more alive, more in touch with our own humanity, more able to connect with each other. And so I trust that. I allow myself to feel my own emotions when I'm with patients. Dr. Yalom, in his book, Existential Psychotherapy, talks about that. He works really hard to minimize the doctor-patient power gap. And as ministers or chaplains, we spiritual caregivers, there is that presumed power gap that we are the anointed agents of the divine sacred. And I try to minimize that. I'm another human being dealing with these things as well. Now, it's not our opportunity to do work on ourselves, but I want them to know I'm with them, wrestling with these things. Follow the patient's lead. Honor their story. In April, we're going to do a part 2 of this webinar that really is it's about a narrative approach to doing these things, about the stories we create and how powerful and important they are as someone is dying. So that'll be coming up in April, a whole webinar just on a narrative approach to providing spiritual care. So having the end-of-life conversation, Kubler-Ross in her book on death and dying, and Yalom talks about this in his book, Existential Psychotherapy. Well, it's really in the long run how we have dealt with our own death complex that helps us or enables us to be in this place with our patients. And if you or I are afraid or terrorized about the prospect of dying, we bring that with us into the room when we're with a dying person. So it's important for us to think about this stuff and to wrestle with it ourselves. Not that we're going to cure it or fix it, but that we are, in a sense, befriending it, knowing that it's there, and have some measure of peace with it because we bring it with us every time we're with a dying patient. There is a spiritual law of the universe. You cannot give what you do not have. And so I'm always working on these things for myself as well. So, oh, there it is. I knew I had that somewhere. You cannot give what you do not have. So some ideas to help soothe existential distress in folks that you're called to serve. As I said earlier, I try to specifically reflect back to them where their lives had meaning, where they've shared that with me, or how they've made my life meaningful. Patients love to hear that from us, how we have impacted them, because that's a real source of meaning is in their days of waiting to die, that if they can see their time has brought meaning to me. Now, you can't just make something up. It can't be phony. It's got to be the real stuff. One of the things, I think if there's anything I do, I try to treat the dying person as normal. I don't try to walk on eggshells. I don't try to dance around things. I tease with them. I joke with them. I'm serious when they want to be serious. But I just try to treat them like they're a normal person and that this is normal. Dying is what happens to everybody. I try to reframe the vulnerability that they're having as an invitation to greater intimacy. And so sometimes I'll share the story of my own mother's dying. My mother died when she was 44. And I had just moved home from college to help care for her. I was 25 years old, dumber than dirt, didn't know anything. My mom was dying, 7-year battle of breast cancer. Originally, they did a double mastectomy, and then it got into her uterus. So they did a hysterectomy, and then it ended up in her bones. In the last year of her life, she basically laid on the couch of our family room, used crutches to get around, and that was her dying process. Did the chemo, the radiation, her hair fell out, her face mooned up, all that stuff. And so I moved home the last 3 months to care for her. I had 3 younger sisters in high school. My dad was working, so I came home to care for her. And it was hard. I'm not going to try it. It was hard. But it was such a rich experience. It was possibly the greatest gift my mother ever gave me. It was to teach me that I was stronger and kinder than I knew I was. And that those days were so intimate in caring for her. And it made my grieving afterwards so much easier because I knew I had done everything I could for this woman who had birthed me, had nurtured me, had given me life. It was incredibly powerful. As we face these existential issues, the possibility for deep intimacy is so wonderful. I remember I met a woman once who was a president of a university, small university. And we were talking, and she told me, similar to my experience, her father was dying, and she cared for him. And her father had always been this larger-than-life person to her, a hero. And as he became vulnerable and needed her, oh, that was so important to her. And they connected at a deeper level than she had ever hoped for as he began to really need her. And then she told me several years after her father died, her husband was killed instantly in a car wreck, and that she had felt cheated, that she didn't get to experience with her own husband what she had got to feel with her father. And so I'm just saying, there's as scary as all this stuff is, the possibility for deep intimacy is so wonderful. And I try and share that with the families as well, to take advantage of the opportunity that is possibly here. It's not guaranteed, doesn't always happen, but it's a possibility. I suggest, and this is the main focus of the book I wrote earlier, or that came out this summer, was how to give a blessing to their loved ones, to capitalize on this intimacy. And so the whole basic function of the book, Time to Talk About Dying, is in non-religious words to explain to people that are dying how to give a blessing to those that will survive them, and how beautifully intimate and relational it can be. And so I talk about a blessing is simply seeing something beautiful in the people that you love. Telling you love somebody is great, but if I can tell you why I love you, there's so much more power in that. And unlike a life review or a ethical will, if you're familiar with the term ethical will, it's not just, here's what I found to be important in life, you might find this, but it's specifically seeing someone that you love and what it is you love about them, and telling it, communicating that to them in some way. So I'll have patients that are on their deathbed. They're laying there staring at the ceiling, waiting to die. Why am I still doing it? And I'll tell them, look, here's a project you can do. Think of this. You've got these 4 or 5 people in your family that you really, really love. Have you told them what it is you love about them and how special and important they are to you? Think about this in the days you're laying here and communicate that to them in some way. Send them an email or call them in here. Call them on the phone. or have them come in and look them in the eye and tell them what you see is so beautiful and special about them. Now, here's my thinking. If I can get my patient to stop thinking about their own life and they're just waiting around to die, that's therapy for them, and particularly if I can get them thinking about people they love. And if they could give this kind of a blessing or a gift to somebody they love, I'm expecting that that person's bereavement process will be alleviated because they will have gotten this incredibly rich gift from this person they love before they died. Can you imagine, for example, imagine your own mother or father. Let's imagine your father was dying, called you into the room, looked you into the eye and said, I am so proud of you. I'm so proud to be your father. Here are gifts in you that I think are important that you need to invest your life in. You are a loyal person. You are a caring person. You have great compassion in you. Give yourself to these things because that will be important in your life and the people in you. Can you imagine if your father would have said that to you as he was dying? What a gift that would be. So I'm trying to get my patients to think of ways to do this that are congruent with their family, their life situation, and if I can get them to do that, I'm helping the family, I'm helping the patient. So that's a big part of what my book is about. It's trying to be able to do that. And to give the gifts of affirmation and acceptance. Because you and I are agents of religion, agents of the divine. Giving affirmation is really important because many of the folks, I'm sure you are aware, that you and I meet have been hurt in churches or faith communities and made to feel non-accepted. And so I try to do everything I can to give affirmation and acceptance because that's what God has always given to me. Oh, so I talked about a blessing. So in their book, John Trent and Gary Smalley, The Gift of the Blessing, they're evangelical Christian writers that looked at biblical blessings, and these were 5 elements in a blessing that they see comprise a blessing: meaningful touch, spoken words, expressing high value, picturing a special future, and a commitment to make that happen. And so I tried in my book to do that with sort of non-religious words because so many of the people I visit in, I'm going to back up. I'll get to that in a minute. Many of the people that I visit are not religious. Here in Oregon, there's just a lot of people don't go to any kind of a church. We have a lot of spiritual but not religious. I'm sure that's growing in your area as well. So, but sometimes, and I don't want to make it sound like that Fred is just Dr. Feelgood and he comes in and he's a pushover and namby-pamby and all that stuff. There are times as chaplains, as spiritual caregivers, that we have to be somewhat prophetic in our role as well. And so sometimes I will challenge if somebody is in a self-scripting narrative, and we'll talk more about this in April, but that's not helpful to themselves or to the people that love them. I remember in particular there was a man I call David when I was doing my chaplaincy training, or just after I had finished my CPE. I did my residency at St. Louis University Hospital in St. Louis. And after that, I got a PRN job at a hospice house. So I was working at a hospice house in St. Louis, and I had a patient named David who was a little Jewish man that I really, really liked. He and I became fast friends because we realized early on we both loved to argue. That was just, we loved arguing. And so I would visit him twice a week for at least an hour each time. I mean, it was a great gift of time that I was able to do that. And we would argue about everything: politics, sports, religion, music. And we found that often halfway through the argument we had switched sides just because we enjoyed the arguing so much. But anyway, so David was this, and he used to love to throw people out of his room, little Jewish man. He would say, "Oh, my chaplain is here, everybody get out." And so I would sit and we would argue. And so as I got to know him, he told me he had been married four times. And the greatest gift that he had ever given to his wives was to divorce them because he was a terrible husband. But he did have an adopted daughter from one of the marriages, and that she was now a PhD living, I think, in Chicago, about 5 hours north, bright woman, and she would come to visit him about every 4 to 6 weeks for a visit for a day or a weekend in St. Louis at the hospice house. And as we got moving along, and I think he had COPD or something like that, you know, he had trouble breathing. So as it came along, he left word at the nurses' station at the hospice house. When he started to actively die, he did not want his daughter notified. Now this, of course, set all the nurses off because the nurses want to fix everything and make it all, put a bow around it, and everybody be wonderful. So the nurses came to me and said, you got to go talk to him because he won't let us call his daughter when he starts to actively die. And I, as a good chaplain, you know, CPE training, I told the nurses, that's your issue, deal with it. And I went into his room, and he goes, they sent you in here, didn't they? I said, well, they tried. I said, well, I don't want her notified. I said, look, David, I don't care. He said, well, I don't want her notified. It's my life. I don't want anybody here when I'm dying. I said, I don't care. And so we went back and forth like that for about 20 minutes or so. And I did challenge him, and here's what I said. I said, you know, I will say this. I do find it somewhat amusing that you have decided what this incredibly intelligent PhD woman is to know. You're treating her like an infant, that you've decided what she can and cannot know. And I just think that's interesting. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you're treating her like an infant. And so he started to hem and haw and scream, and then finally, after a few minutes, he said, look, you want to know the truth? The truth is, I'm afraid she won't want to be here, okay? And I looked at him, and I said, I can understand that. All right, I'll honor that. We will not let her know when you start to actively die. So we talked about it, other things, and we fought. And a week later, I came back, and he said, you know, I thought about what you said. When I start to actively die, will you come? I said, no. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you made it very clear. You did not want anybody here when you are actively dying. When you're actively dying, you want to be alone. He said, shut up. You're my chaplain. You better be here. And I said, of course, I'll be here. So we worked that out. A couple of weeks later, his daughter came down for a visit. They were laying on his bed watching a movie. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he turned over to her and he said, yeah, when I start to actively die, would you want to know? Would you come? And he told me, she grabbed him and started to cry. She said, of course I will come. You're my father. I love you. And I like to think that's how David slew Goliath. Now, I don't know that my conversation or my questions had anything to do with him letting her into his life that way. But he did let her in, and that was important. And that's what I'm saying, this fear of death and dying and this existential stuff, if we can talk about it, it is the possibility for deep relationship. And that is the great, powerful therapy for all of that stuff. We're not going to cure it, but we can make it hurt a lot less. So, back to this slide. So how do we know if what we're doing is of any value? How do we know if we're getting anywhere? How do we know if we're helping people through their existential distress? I explained to you what the symptoms of existential distress were. So here's what I look for in the symptoms or signs of a healthy soul or a healthy spirit. Most of you guys, I'm sure, work in or are around medical facilities enough to know what the vital signs are like. Anybody in a hospital for more than 3 hours, they're coming in to wake you up to check the vitals. Got to check the vital signs. The blood pressure and temperature and oxygen saturation, all that stuff. So, and those are just signs. Those are numbers that give the doctors and nurses a relative idea of the health or not of somebody's body. And so the numbers go up and down. They're not static, but there are safe ranges. For example, if you have a blood pressure over 145 over 88, nobody's going to freak out all that much. But if it's 228 over 110, all the bells and whistles, there'll be a rapid response team with a gurney and everything running. And so there's safe margins. So I've developed over the years, what I look for are spiritual vital signs. You show up, particularly as a chaplain, and people think you're a minister, and so they give you the God talk. Oh, bless God, praise God, everybody here's doing well. Yeah, I'm getting ready to go meet Jesus. It's going to be wonderful, my family. And you know they're lying, but that's what they do to ministers. And so cutting through all the religious talk, these are things I look for in the signs of a healthy soul or a healthy spirit. Gratitude, generosity, surrender, and blessing. And I'll talk more about these. I'll unpack these in the April webinar, but I want to give you a sense of here's the kinds of things I look for in the heart of a healthy soul. Now these, and I'm not trying to say once you get to these things that they stay. You know, they come and go like everything else. One afternoon I might be feeling grateful and generous, and the next day all terrified and afraid. It's up and down, it's back and forth, but generally these are the things I'm looking for: an ability to bless the people in their life, a surrender to the reality of what's really going on right now. These are the kinds of things that I'm looking for, and as I say, I'll unpack those a little bit in April. But I wanted to give you a teaser of what it is we're aiming for. You know, if you don't have a target, you're never going to hit it. So some ideas to soothe existential suffering. Remember, there's no cure for this stuff. At the end of life, there's only temporary relief, but that's enough. I often tell the folks here at the office, I'm just spiritual Rolaids. I'm temporary relief at best. My goal is that when I visit somebody, they're having a little better day because I showed up than if I hadn't come at all. That's what I'm looking for. And we get to the compassion word because I think doing this kind of work hopefully helps you and I become more compassionate and helps the people we serve become more compassionate. And the late, great Henry Nouwen says it so beautifully: compassion's hard because it requires the inner disposition to go with others to that place where they're weak, vulnerable, lonely, and broken. And it's not our spontaneous response to suffering. We want to run the other way. What we desire most is to do away with suffering by fleeing from it or giving it Haldol or Seroquel or Ativan. But he writes, our ability to enter into solidarity with those who suffer is our greatest gift. I like to say sometimes, what if you and I are the best medicine that our patients really need? Boy, there's a humbling thought. And so before we get to the question and answer time, and you guys have an opportunity to share some of your wisdom in your own practice with the rest of us, here's a little haiku that I found in Frank Ostastevsky's book, The Five Invitations. I love this. Empty-handed, I entered the world. Barefoot, I leave it. My coming, my going. Two simple happenings, they got entangled. And that's the way Kozan Ichikyo in 1360 thought about his own life. So my sisters and my brothers, that's pretty much what I had to present. I think Nick is going to tell us what to do now, how to have some back and forth between your wisdom and whatever responses I might have.
Thank you. And at this time, we'll begin the question and answer session. Please type your question into the Q&A area at the lower left-hand side of your screen. And please hold for a moment while our system compiles your responses. And if you have any questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A area on the left-hand side of your screen. And our first question comes from Stephen. How do you help the other disciplines on your team to understand the value of existential pain?
Stephen, that's a good question. Generally, they're the ones asking me about it because here's the thing. It's the kind of pain and questions that nobody can fix or cure. So they'll often come, oh, they're talking about this, what can I say or what can I do? And so they generally are bringing the existential issues to me, hoping that I'm going to have some kind of a solution. And I just try and calm them down, say, look, this is very normal. We all deal with this, and we can all help. And what I try to reinforce is it's the relationship that's really therapeutic. So just talking about it with the folks. But generally, it's the colleagues that like to bring it up. And through IDG and sitting through all the IDG meetings, and I've worked here going on 8 years now, so they've heard me ad nauseum talk about this stuff, so they know this is stuff I love to talk about, and so they'll come with the questions, and I generally help them because a lot of times, look, I'm sure it's the same with you. People see the chaplain word in the family of the patient. Oh no, we don't want some minister coming here to make us feel guilty or to try to convert us. And so sometimes, about half of the time, we get declined at the outset. They don't want the chaplain coming. So my colleagues, the social workers, and particularly bath aides, I love our bath aides. The bath aides know more about what's really going on in a family's home than any of the rest of us because the bath aides have no power. They're seeing naked people and they're wiping butts and they're helping people toilet and they're considered powerless. And so they get to see more reality than anybody. So I often encourage them on how to just be relational and help deal with these things. And then oftentimes our colleagues get chaplains in so that we actually end up seeing, I would say, well over 2/3 of the people through our hospice. And we have about 600 or 700 folks a year come through our hospice service here. And so we see, I would say, on average, well over 2/3 of those. But at first, we often get declines. So hopefully that's some helpful thoughts.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Lori. Do you distinguish between existential questions and existential distress, suffering?
Well, yes, and it's a level of pain. So everybody's got existential questions. I think that's just being human. But when it's incredibly painful and it's a cause of suffering and people can't sleep or they're acting mean to the people that love them or they're withdrawing into a cocoon kind of a thing. They don't want to talk to anybody or they get depressed. I think so it's everybody's got existential questions. It's our ability to deal with them. And are they causing pain or distress? That's just, if it's causing pain or distress, then I think there are things we can certainly do to help. And like I say, mostly that's all relational. The better and stronger relationships we can develop is what really helps alleviate this stuff. Not going to cure it, but help diminish it.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Kurt. You pray for miracles. I assume you believe in them as well?
Absolutely, I do. I should tell you my background. My mother was Jewish, culturally so, not religious. My mother and grandmother were always afraid of being persecuted. But my father was Catholic, so my mother converted to Catholicism when I was about 2. I was raised Catholic. Then I was a Pentecostal preacher for about 30 years, traveling as an itinerant healing evangelist and preacher. And now I'm a Congregationalist, a United Church of Christ minister. And I was married for many years to a Zen Buddhist monk. And so I'm still Pentecostal. I tell the people at my UCC church, Pentecostal is something that happens to you. You don't sign up for it. So yeah, I absolutely believe in miracles. It's just the certitude of the explanations of why they happen and what they mean. I don't have the same certitude I did before, but the belief in them, absolutely, I do.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Leslie. Have you ever worked with pediatric patients at end of life? If so, would you have parents or caregivers offer a blessing or some other intervention?
I have not I really can't intelligently speak to that. I've not worked with children. When I was a hospital chaplain, there were times I was called, but that was after an infant had already died, and the grief was so overpowering, I ended up crying, and I needed help after I took care of the families. And so when it comes to pediatric or young children care, I'm not, I'm sorry, that's beyond my scope of practice. I'm not, I would be crying all the time. I couldn't do that work.
Thank you. Our next question from Joe. How do you discern when to be directive with patients or more passive in the care you provide?
Oh, boy, that's a great question, Joe. It depends on two things for me. One is the depth of relationship. I will only challenge or confront somebody when I know they know I love them. When we've developed a strong enough relationship, you can't push a 40-pound wheelbarrow over a 20-pound bridge. And so when I know they know I'm committed to them, I love them, I care for them, I feel more freedom to challenge and to confront, and I generally do it in a lighthearted way. That's my nature. But it also depends on the moment. There are some moments it's appropriate to do that, and just some moments it's not, regardless of the relationship. And so it's dependent upon timing, and it's dependent on depth of relationship. But I would also say that's the only way you really develop a real deep relationship, is with some challenge and confronting. If you take no risks with someone, you're not going to develop any kind of a relationship. Any relationship of depth at some point has risk-taking involved. Now, I always try to minimize the risk, and if it goes south, I take the blame that it's my fault, but the only way you're going to get to any depth of relationship is with some risk. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next question from Susan. I'm curious, you seem to use pain, suffering, and distress interchangeably. Are they in fact the same in your understanding, or do you distinguish these?
I probably have been throwing them around interchangeably during this talk. They are different in my mind. And Frank Ostaszewski, the guy who helped start the San Francisco Zen Hospice Project and wrote a beautiful book, 5 Invitations, I highly recommend it, has a great quote. He says, pain is alleviated by morphine. Suffering is not alleviated by morphine. And the difference, as I understand, and in my own studies as I've read, pain is basically biological, technically, in its nature. So it's nerves pressing against bone, or it's tissue gone bad. Pain is more biological. Suffering is often our emotional response to pain. So suffering is more of an emotional component to it than actual pain. And I think they are different, but I probably have been negligent in throwing them around interchangeably during this.
Thank you.
And I apologize for that.
Our next question comes from Kathleen. How do we work with the blocks to intimacy?
Oh, boy. What can you explain? I mean, blocks to intimacy. Look, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. There's some people that just, look, I am an old, bald white man. Some people just don't want to become intimate with an old, bald white man or a Christian minister. And so I accept that. But I'd look for ways, are there folks on our team that they might be able to relate to more? And I have found you can't push people. I hate it when somebody tries to push me into something. If there's people that want to push into my life or become deeper friends than I want to be, I resist and I retreat. And so I don't, for me, the word I love is always inviting. If I can invite and somebody wants to respond, it's totally up to them. But for me, this is also one of the beautiful things about our craft of chaplaincy, is we are one of the people or one of the folks on the palliative or hospice team that really helps give autonomy back to the patient. For many of our patients, most of their autonomy has been stripped away. They can't drive anymore. We give them crummy pajamas that have no back on them. They're pooping, they're peeing, what they eat, what they can't eat. much of their autonomy has been stripped from them. But whether they want to see me or not gives them some sense of autonomy. And so, it's always inviting. All I can do is invite intimacy. You can't make it happen. You can't push it. So if there's blocks, I'll try and name them, address them, and invite, but it's totally up to the other person. It's their life. They're the hero in their story. I'm the bit player.
Thank you. And Kathleen, also questions. How would you actually answer if someone asks what happens after death?
Well, once again, it depends on what I know of their belief system, because I don't want to impose, what the depth of relationship we have. If we're two old folks sitting in a room wondering about it, I'll tell them what I think if they really want to know. But my normal response when somebody says that is, I don't know, I haven't been there yet. And then I'll couch what I say with, look, I have strong opinions about what happens next, but I realize they're just opinions because I haven't been there. And then I will share, my personal belief about the afterlife. But I couch it with, it's my opinion, because nobody knows for sure. But I will honestly tell them what I think. And I honestly ask them, what do you think? And so that it's a real give and take conversation, as opposed to me dogmatically giving definitive certainty where I think there is not a lot of certainty. I don't want to do that.
Thank you. And Mark asks, how does one balance the energy of deep relationships and compassion fatigue?
Oh, boy, Mark, I think that's a great question. I think, now this may seem counterintuitive, I think compassion fatigue comes when we try not to be compassionate, when we try to withhold our emotions and feelings. I heard a wonderful lecture on compassion fatigue from a colleague of mine here in Oregon that works for Providence, the same health system I do. Her name is Denise Hess. She's in the Portland area, HESS. And she was talking about compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue comes from giving what we don't, trying to give what we don't have. And that's where the fatigue really comes in. And I think a lot of times as we try to hold our emotions in check and not give, that can help add to that. I find when I allow myself to feel whatever compassion, whatever depth there is, it does suck energy out of you. And I will drive home tired, and sometimes I cry, but I feel incredibly human. And like when you exercise, there's some pain that feels good, like, oh, that's good. There's good pain and there's bad pain. There's some sapping of energy that's just good. And so as I express my compassionate feelings, yes, it is exhausting. Yes, it's tiring. I have to exercise. I have to eat appropriately. I have to care for myself in all the ways you and I know how to do that. But there's something that makes me feel so alive and so human in all that it's actually replenishing. But when I try not to do it, if I try to guard, if I want to guard my heart, that can really make me hard and really exasperate, whatever the word is, compassion fatigue.
Thank you. And Jason writes, much of your interactions with previous patients seems quite intuitive on your part. Is there a framework of existential prompting questions that you commonly utilize?
I don't have a lot of questions that I ask. Here's a couple of the questions I do ask. As you think about, and depending on how long I know their prognosis is, as you think about the next couple of weeks or month, is there anything at all that concerns you? And then I just shut up. I may wait 2 or 3 minutes before they say anything. Silence is an incredibly powerful thing. So I'll ask, is there anything at all that concerns you? Or is there anything at all that you hope for? And then I'll just be quiet. Another question that I find to be helpful, and this is from Stephen Jenkinson, I think is the guy's name, from Canada, who wrote the book Die Wise. He will ask, what is your understanding of what's going on with you? And I love that question because, you know, what the doctors and what the families may have to say could be quite different from what the patient has to say. So my great go-to questions are, what's your understanding of what's going on in your life right now? Or is there anything that concerns you? Or is there anything that you hope for? So those would be sort of the prompting questions that I rely on. There's not a lot, but so yeah, those are the ones I got.
Thank you. And then Glenn is curious, have you ever experienced music being effective with helping people's existential pain?
Oh, I think, yes. Oh, good golly. Music is incredibly wonderful. It's beyond my scope of practice. Here in Oregon, we have, I don't know where you are, they have these things, the threshold choir, where there are 2 or 3 folks that will come in on little stools and sing. Some of the folks that I visit love that stuff. I would hate it. I'm such an introvert. If I had a bunch of strangers coming into my deathbed, and I've told the folks here this, like the No One Dies Alone stuff, if you guys bring a bunch of strangers in for me, I'll come back and haunt all of you. I want to be, I'm an introvert. I don't want a bunch of strangers in my room. But, and I'm not particularly, of my own taste, fond of harp music, but we have people that absolutely love the harp, and I know that there are certain harpists that have been trained in thanatology that match the strumming to the breath rate, and it's incredibly powerful. So yes, and then we're playing this particular music that is important, that the patient loves. Oh, I think there's great value in that. I just don't know a lot about that, and I don't do music, so it's not part of my practice. But we do have folks that do, and we utilize them quite a bit.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Arlie. How do you approach people who clearly want DWD in order to avoid their existential distress, possibly missing an opportunity for growth and blessing by working through the pain?
Our DWD, I suppose you mean Death with Dignity, a physician-assisted. Here in Oregon, it's the law, and I work for a huge Catholic system that is not supportive of the choice of death with dignity. But because it's the law, we certainly support patients and families that choose that because it's the law. That's what we do. And I'm ordained by the United Church of Christ, which is very supportive of death with dignity. So similar to what a lot of the folks here in Oregon, there's some family members that are supportive of it, some with not. You can, if you're interested in death with dignity or physician aid in dying, the state of Oregon, at their Oregon.gov website, keeps incredible records of this, and they have for the last 13 or 14 years. Most everybody that wants, or the most frequent users of that option are generally older white men that are middle class or above and pretty well educated. So those are the people that generally want it. And it's one of the reasons, quite honestly, that I wanted to study about existential distress, because in the state of Oregon, in all the statistics they keep, every year, the top 4 reasons why people choose physician-assisted death is existential issues. Physical pain comes in generally at around number 5, is the 5th reason. But it's the number 1 fear is the terror of becoming a burden to my loved ones. I call it the great American mortal sin, whether anybody goes to church or not. The terror of becoming a burden to my loved ones, that's the number 1. Or I can't do what I want anymore, my quality of, so the number 1 reason, the top 4 reasons people choose death with dignity generally are all existential. So I figure if I can help people with their existential distress, maybe they might not want to choose that. They might still, it's their life, they can do what they want. But if I can offer them another alternative, why not? And if they, because the growth is really as much for their family as them. One of the real negative side effects of death with dignity is the grieving process for the survivors. Often, not always, but often there is some ambivalence, and the surviving loved ones feel just ambivalent about it. Did my loved one die because I didn't do enough, or if I could have been more? And I don't want to leave families with that kind of additional grief in their bereavement process. But it's a complex issue. But my hope is I want to at least offer something that's non-pharmaceutical to maybe help alleviate the drivers for those things. And if people still want to choose to do it, it's the law. They can do what they want.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Rachel. How often do you see particular family dynamic tensions as a significant part of existential suffering?
Always. I mean, when someone's existentially suffering, everybody in the room is feeling it and is caught up in it. It's there. I mean, it's scary because, as I say, this is stuff we all deal with. This addresses all of our humanity, it pushes all of our buttons. And so it does affect everybody. But I think that's where, when we do our CPE training, the units we do on family systems is quite helpful. And once again, I'm going to go back to my mantra, we're not going to cure this stuff, but if we can get folks just talking about it in as a non-emotional way as possible, just frankly, honestly talking about it, it does dial it down, and it helps everybody in the whole family system gets therapy value from it. But you can only do that as you can, And there's some moments you can and some moments you can't. The goal is try to minimize the amount of suffering and pain that there is by doing what you can.
Thank you. And then Stephen asks, you say that talking about existential pain diminishes its pain. Has there been any research, study, or other literature about this?
Oh, absolutely. Go to Yalom. Yalom is the great Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M, particularly in his book, Existential Psychotherapy, classic, written in 1980. It's a huge book. It's like 500-600 pages. But he talks about in fact, what he did and what I did, and I've addressed it in my book, is if you can get people in groups. He did group therapy with people talking about this stuff. It was incredibly helpful. But yes, Yalom is the great go-to on this. But there's tons of research that the talking about it is the best thing you can do.
Thank you. Our next question from Kurt. How do you and your team work together to discern what is terminal restlessness and existential pain?
Oh, boy. That is... I'm going back to our existential issue of uncertainty. How do you know? We can't hook a meter up to somebody, to their body, to know whether it's terminal restlessness, it's existential. But a lot of that has to do with how communicative or not they are. Often the people that have terminal restlessness have gotten beyond the point, at least in my experience here, of being all that communicative. So I can't talk to them about what's going on because they can't communicate with me or I with them. So that's generally addressed pharmaceutically by the medical director and by the nurses. But most of the terminal agitation, like I say, it's beyond the ability to verbally communicate. But it is, you never really know. It's just part of the uncertainty of all this. We try to make this a science, that it's always predictable, and it's not. Somebody asked earlier how intuitive all this is. A lot of this is incredibly intuitive, and we never really know for sure. My go-to is if in my heart, in my soul, I've tried to do the most loving thing I can for this other person, then whatever it is, I really can't mess up. It's when I try to do things to make somebody or push somebody to do something, generally doesn't go well. But if I'm trying to lovingly serve this other person, it generally goes well. Now, I think, Nick, we're at time, and because I am a Pentecostal minister, I always like to end with a blessing. So if it's all right, I would like to share a blessing from John O'Donohue, his book, To Bless This Space Between Us, which should be in your toolkit. It's an incredible book of just various blessings by this beautiful Irish poet, philosopher, just wonderful man, John O'Donohue, who died about 5 years ago. This is a blessing he wrote for his mother, and it's called Beannacht, B-E-A-N-N-A-C-H-T. You can Google it, O'Donohue, Beannacht, it'll come right up. But so here's a blessing to sort of end our time, and it goes like this. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. When your eyes freeze behind the gray windows and the ghosts of loss get into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, awaken in you a meadow of delight. And the canvas frays in a carrot of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you. May there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the oceans be yours. And may the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life. Amen. Thank you.
And thank you all for your attention. This concludes today's presentation. All participants may now disconnect.